over the weekend, it was pretty amusing reading and seeing some of the political analysis of Scott Morrison's overseas trip to Rome and Glasgow last week. As you know, and as I pointed out last week on the program, the media and the left, to the extent that there are any difference between those two concepts, they got themselves into such a lather, heaping scorn upon the Prime Minister, as they usually do, backing other nations' interests against Australia, as they usually do, and barracking for drastic climate change action, as they usually do. But the upshot at the end of all this, forget the media coverage, the spin, forget what public polling might be showing right now too, forget the Twitter sphere, and think about where last week left the two major parties structurally, as I like to say, in the lead up to the election, which is only 6 months away. That's always what you've got to do. Look at the basics of the debate and where it's heading. Yes, the polls have Labor ahead now, as they would do, and the coalition is trying to protect the narrowest of majorities. And Morrison, I think, has been loath to actually have a fight. Too often he's placating critics rather than taking them on. But consider this. First, there was more good news for the economy last week. Morrison and the coalition will be going to the election next year with unemployment even lower, with growth on the up, and the budget in a better position than predicted. And they'll be boasting about an economic position post-pandemic that's better than just about any other developed nation, the envy of the world. Now, that's big. It's hard to overstate the importance of that economic situation as an electoral strong point. Second, though, after going too far on climate promises, in my view, by signing up to net zero by 2050, Morrison is still in a good place on the climate policy issue relative to Labor, because Glasgow was the hopeless joke many of us expected. Labor, the Greens, the media, they all talked up a big outcome for the planet for Glasgow. Morrison seemed to expect it himself. That's why he signed up to net zero by 2050. But it was a circus, and countries accounting for more than 40% of global emissions, 40% and rising, they thumbed their nose at the net zero by 2050 goal. So once more, it's clear that Australia is not a laggard. In fact, the more cautious we are on this stuff, the wiser we'll be. But more importantly, Labor are still promising to do more. They always want to promise more on climate. And when they do, they'll be ripe for attack. At the last election, Labor promised to cut emissions 45% by 2030. And we're on track in this country to cut our emissions by about 30% by then. So Labor either has to explain how it's going to go substantially further, or whether it's just going to accept what the government's already doing.
You know, our policy development is well advanced. As I've said, we've announced a big suite of policies, much more than the government, which shows how seriously we take climate change, but we also have much more to say.
Look, as I said on the show last week, come in spinner. They'd be smart just to go with the flow, because Australia is already doing too much, promising too much. But Labor will be driven by its socialist green left to promise more, to recklessly go further. Dear oh dear, repeating old mistakes. And also, on France and nuclear submarines, Labor remains firmly on the wrong side of the argument, attacking Morrison rather than defending Australia's submarine sovereignty.
And if the world's leaders are questioning his integrity, that is a problem for Australia. And he has doubled down on his lack of integrity in his response. I mean, Emmanuel Macron did not attack Australia, and he has just underlined his own lack of honesty by asserting that he did.
Now, as I said up in the lead up to the last election campaign and during that campaign, Labor put themselves in a losing position. It wasn't the genius of the coalition, it was Labor's own actions. They were up against an unpopular and divided government and might have been able to win, except they promised upheaval with higher taxes and more extreme climate policies. If they offered sensible policies this time around, they again, of course, would be in the box seat to win. But up against a government that's the envy of the world on pandemic management, they're going to have to do better than backing Emmanuel Macron and promising ever more drastic climate action. The government will argue that Labor is a risk in a scary world with a rising and belligerent China. And with Labor barracking for France on the subs deal and hurting Australia on climate policies, while China continues to dominate and expand global emissions, well, that argument, of course, is going to resonate. So it was no surprise to hear the Prime Minister talking like this today.
Australia, under our government, has had the strength to stand up to those who would seek to counter our interests. You've got to have the strength to do those things. And our government has the strength to stand up for Australia and, importantly, do the right things by our economy that keeps people in jobs.
It's a bit of a head nod line, isn't it? Now, I'd like Morrison to do more. I'd like to see more battles enjoined on tax reform, on nuclear energy, on education, on reforming the ABC. But that there, what you just saw, is more than just a bit of daily political rhetoric. That argument about showing strength in the national interest, that's the bones of a campaign strategy. That's a case that plays to the government's strong points and exposes Labor's self-imposed weaknesses.